the Treasury Department intends to pursue a relentless warfare against the despicable, dope-peddling vulture who preys on the weakness of his fellow man.
Forget everything you know about America's war on drugs. Where it started, when it started, and most importantly, who was involved. This is a war we are still fighting today. A war that began at the beginning of the 20th century. The illicit international drug trade was created and structured by some of the most notorious gangsters in American history. This is the untold history of America's original drug lords.
Since the beginning of recorded human history, there have been narcotics, be it plants, later synthesized. People have always sought some kind of escape, used it for their cultural reasons, medical reasons. Abuse comes later. Where did the root of the heroin problem originate? It originated with the invention of morphine.
Once this was a poppy growing in Italy or Turkey. The dried juice of this plant produces opium, a powerful drug. Contained in opium is morphine, used by doctors to relieve severe pain.
Opium came into the country in the late 19th century, largely through Chinese workers who had come to work on the railroad in the US. And in 1875, you saw the first local ordinance against a drug, and that was against opium, but it was specifically against smoking opium, which was the method that Chinese workers and immigrants tended to use to consume it.
If you were to pick up the LA Times in the 1890s and scan through the want ads, you're going to find advertisements for sanitariums, for home remedies for curing addictions to things like laudanum, morphine, cocaine. And so obviously they had a problem of great magnitude.
There wasn't a huge demand for drugs. Morphine, you could buy it across the drug counter. Many housewives were hooked on these medicinal elixirs that they would buy. That's where they got their drugs. The drug market was inhabited by crooks, lowlife pickpockets, the lowest strategy of society. It wasn't a major marketplace.
Morphine causes a problem in America, early 20th century. The drugs were coming in long before the public ever realized it. But why? Why were people addicted to opiates and cocaine? Why did this become a problem? It started because of human nature.
The question of whether a drug is legal or illegal is not based in its chemistry, it's based in its social meanings and the practices that are engaged around its consumption. In 1915, the establishment of the Harrison Act puts a big dent in the way cocaine and morphine have been distributed in this country. As such, it was just a stamp act, a revenue act. It was an administrative move, but it was used to prosecute so many physicians. Estimates run as high as many tens of thousands of physicians who were punished under the Harrison Act for distributing drugs.
Cocaine and opium, there was a lot of fear that Chinese men specifically were using opium to seduce white women in their seedy opium dens. So both these drugs were very heavily racialized in 1910s America and then effectively banned.
They decide to limit the ability for the regular citizen to get this product. The problem is we already had roughly estimated 200,000 addicts in New York alone. So now what you have is an underbelly of society, regular people that are hooked on possibly the most powerful narcotic that anyone had ever seen.
As the use of and in possession of these drugs is increasingly criminalized, the public health aspect drops out. And so you don't have patients. Where you used to have patients, you now have people who are doing illegal things. So that habitué turns into an addict, turns into a fiend, and you can hear the taint coming upon it. You get an equation between drug takers and criminals.
Addiction to drugs, too often acquired with tragic carelessness, may take control of a life and force actions not dreamed of before. To these addicts, life's only work is to find money for drugs.
So heroin, morphine, cocaine all becomes contraband. At that point, illicit businessmen saw the potential lucrative outcome of buying into this black market trade. Hence, you have the creation of the international drug trade by 1923. It was in full force.
When you harken back to the Prohibition era, and there was secret clubs, speakeasies, blind pigs, flappers. It was this renaissance of jazz music. It's very romanticized. It's very romantical. That cannot be said about narcotics or the drug trade. It's not romantic. It's sinister, it's dirty, it's ugly.
The 1920s, the roaring 20s, this was a time of money, of partying. Everybody seemed to be doing well. It was excess to the 10th power. Flappers, pretty girls dancing on the bars, guys in classy suits. It was the jazz age. It was the great Gatsby of the time.
Prohibition is a strategy of total suppression of a particular commodity. The Harrison Act goes down in 1915. Prohibition goes into effect in 1920. Now we have in place the legal model that will only apply for 13 years to alcohol, but will actually take much deeper root with respect to drugs and conditions the framework that we still have in place today.
The trouble with the 18th Amendment is not that it cannot be enforced, but it is that there has grown up an alliance between organized crime and corrupt politics.
In the United States, we had legal prohibition of alcohol, and that experience familiarized us with many of the effects of prohibition, and the same effects apply to the prohibition on drugs. Those effects include loss of revenue, meaning no party to the transaction pays taxes on it. Other effects include a lack of product regulation, meaning that in the case of alcohol, there could be bad alcohol. In the case of drugs, there can be bad drugs, more dangerous for consumers.
Prohibition is a way to control people. And white America saw millions of people coming in from Italy, from Eastern Europe, from Ireland, and they were afraid, and they wanted to control these people. They're drunks, we don't like them drinking, let's get rid of that. They're drug addicts, let's get rid of that too. When the very same waspy people who've been in America for 200 years were drinking and doing drugs. But it's easy to pick on the new guy.
You get the emergence of a figure called the drug fiend, drug dealers. Addict, in fact, was a relatively recent word. In the 19th century, people were called habitués. They were thought to be habituated to the drugs. It had no moral taint. It didn't have the moral taint of alcoholism, even.
The undercurrent of the Roaring 20s was laced with opium. This was the era where they realized not only was booze prohibited, but so too had become narcotics that were once readily available in catalogs.
In any type of business, there's a law of supply and demand. When the government makes stuff illegal, that's where, you know, the organized crime like the mafia and the black market comes in. Because if people want something, it doesn't matter if it's heroin, cocaine, alcohol, marijuana, whatever it is people want, people are going to sell it. People are going to provide a market for it, especially if they can make money.
The definition of organized crime is that it's a self-perpetuating organization. And that's the problem with drugs also, is you can take down an organization, you can take down the head of an organization, and then another person steps up. It's a constant cycle.
With prohibition of both alcohol and drugs, our government created gangsters. Because prior to prohibition, whether it was alcohol or drugs, guys were street corner hoods, armed robbers, but with all the money that came with prohibition and moved these guys up into power positions. Now they were the ones calling the shots with the politicians and the judges.
During the Prohibition era, gangsters knew the government couldn't keep booze from public very long. They had the foresight. They knew drugs were always going to be considered bad.
The transition from the bootlegger to the drug dealer is a fairly smooth transition. They're functioning somewhat similarly. They're functioning similarly economically. They're often working for the same people. And they are occupying a similar social position.
So first of all, you have the customer-supplier relationship that gets established. So you get established relationships between customers in the United States, say a supplier in Europe. So Europe, you can buy alcohol. You could probably smuggle it to the United States and sell it at a considerable markup. So when that commodity switches from booze to dope, you already have that customer supply chain. You see mob guys getting involved in the ports and the longshoremen unions, so they're controlling who's unloading the ships. You start seeing infiltration of local law enforcement, so you have cops that are paid off to look the other way. All this comes about with Prohibition. You see the rise of political corruption. So all those seeds that get planted into this kind of machinations of both the under and upper world at that time definitely continue on and get solidified and even streamlined and expounded upon with the drug trade.
Here's an opportunity to make a lot of money. It could last 2 weeks, it could last 2 months, 10 years. I don't think gangsters thought that far down the road. I think it was all about making big money as fast as possible.
The mob has been in heroin, cocaine, marijuana. They've been in all this since the beginnings. People think that the war on drugs is this new thing, but the war on drugs has been going on since the 1920s.
The American mafia was built on the shoulders of narcotic trafficking. There was so much money to be made. And the amount of money that was coming in, it was definitely narcotics that made them strong.
Drugs are the most lucrative racket of all the rackets. And it's pretty simple. They're addicting. So when somebody becomes addicted to something, especially like heroin, they can't get off it. They have no way off. And so they're going to return every single day and they're going to buy it. So once you build your market or your base, if you're a dealer, it's like a built-in market. You cannot fail.
Certainly during Prohibition, as it progressed, you start to see a lot more involvement of major mafia figures into narcotics.
Gangsters in America become faced with awesome opportunity. Thanks to Prohibition and the Harrison Act, every law that was prohibiting basically any illicit vice. Arnold Rothstein, a Manhattan businessman, contentious, people knew he was up to no good, but yet he had lots of money and always knew where to make an investment. He had forward thinking.
I think Arnold Rothstein is a significant historical figure if we're talking about organized crime. Now, he's a Jewish gangster, so he's not a mafia member, but he was a mentor to some significant Italian mafiosi. Rothstein was a guy who was very diverse in terms of the rackets. If you could make money, Rothstein would get involved in it. We primarily think of Rothstein as involved in illegal gambling. His name is linked to the infamous Black Sox scandal where they fixed the World Series in 1919. But he was involved in other rackets too, including prostitution, but also an early adopter of narcotics trafficking, specifically opium.
He was the finance guy. You know, he wasn't the street boss or the gangster out there getting his hands dirty. You know, he was the one that put up the money. He was the idea man. He made the plan, you know, to go over to Europe, to go over to Corsica, you know, to go over the Middle East and get these heroin connections.
Arnold Rothstein had many roles. He had many nicknames to go with it: the Big Bankroll, the Brain, AR. He was the conduit between legitimate business and the underworld. If you were a bad guy and you had a good idea that could make money, you went to Arnold Rothstein and he would bankroll you. If you were a politician and you need some favors done, you went to Arnold Rothstein and he would get the bad guys to do your dirty work for you.
Rothstein was a business magnate. He was smart and foresaw business trends. Most of them ended up being illicit. Arnold Rothstein went on to mentor what became the mob stars of the future, Jewish, Italian, and Irish gangsters that he taught how to dress, he taught them how to act, he taught them how to behave in public, and how to follow the basic rule of business, supply and demand, which included gambling, liquor, and narcotics. Being that opium and cocaine were now lucrative opportunities, he taught an elite group of them to travel the world and secure these drug deals. Of that group, you had Charlie Lucky Luciano, who already had 2 drug-related crimes on his record by 1926. You had George Uffner, relatively unknown except within circles of Arnold Rothstein and a drug conviction. Sidney Stager, Arnold Rothstein's closest confidant, world-traveling drug addict. Abe Stein. This guy loved the check forging business and traveling the world to arrange drug shipments. Fatty Walsh, not so much the international traveler, but definitely an intimate of those guys and made money from the drug deals.
So Arnold Rothstein was known as one of the early financiers of drug shipments that were coming to the United States, and he was probably one of the first New York-based gangsters to really recognize the income potential from a well-organized drug trafficking network. He set some of the stage for a lot of the larger drug trafficking and drug smuggling operations that would follow.
In the late to mid-20s, he started organizing these trips over to Europe, you know, to cultivate these heroin connections, because the mafia knew that the Volstead Act was coming. The mafia knew, you know, that alcohol was going to be made legal. And this was how they were making their money. They were getting rich off prohibition. So they needed something to replace that income. And that's what they did. They learned from Arnold Rothstein. You know, they started sending their guys out. That's kind of really how they made their bones in the early days of organized crime before they went on to these big stellar careers as mobsters and mafiosos in pop culture.
Arnold Rothstein's drug traffickers had logistics already ironed out from day one. Guys like Uffner, Stager, and Stein would travel abroad to set up or secure drug pipelines. Rothstein would send them to Shanghai, to Formosa, to Belgium, to Paris, to Britain, all to make arrangements for every step of the narcotic process before it would come back into Manhattan.
Rothstein was sending his guys to Europe. It would have been almost like a vacation for these guys because they were heading out on luxury liners, staying in nice suites, because they were putting themselves off as legitimate businessmen. When they got to Europe, it was off to the pharmaceutical companies as legitimate businessmen. Hi, I'm here to buy some large quantity of narcotics for my medical company. And they would get the drugs and then sail on back to America.
How did they get these trunk loads of narcotics in? Besides the paid-off customs agents, they also never put on the bill of lading a real name. It shows up and say a non-paid-off custom agent sees it. The people can watch and see what's happening before they get it because it's a fake name. Nobody's attached. Rothstein and his drug traffickers figured out almost how to beat the system entirely. At least for a decade, they were able to pull this off. Charles H. Tuttle, U.S. Attorney, New York. He changed everything in 1930, being completely fed up with all the narcotics coming into the country, yet nobody knew who was sending them or who was even receiving them. So he argued before an assembly to get a centralized group to deal with the narcotics problem. And there you have it. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics was born, and Harry Anslinger was named the top man.
Harry Anslinger was born in 1892 in Altoona, Pennsylvania, to Swiss and Swiss-German immigrants. He grew up in Altoona as it had become the headquarters of the Pennsylvania Railroad machine shops. Altoona was a company town. By the time he was 14, he worked for the company, as did the vast majority of boys and men in Altoona. He took the lessons that he learned at the foot of the ascendant giant corporation and brought them into government service. It was a very organized company because it was so large, departments and divisions and subdivisions, and he worked his way through many of them, learning how to organize. While he was working for the company, Anslinger spent some time supervising workers on the tracks, and he came in contact with a lot of Sicilian immigrants who were working for the company laying track. He had a deep-seated prejudice against Sicilians, and he claimed later to have known at that time that there was such thing as organized crime that was flying under an Italian flag. So he comes up with corporate values, he comes up with temperance values, he comes up with a personal love for cop action, and then he takes off for Europe with a US delegation, and that cements his self-understanding as a patriot.
One of the interesting things about Anslinger's efforts against drugs is how he was selective against who he went after and who he saw as a threat. So, native-born white drug traffickers weren't targeted as much as the Jewish drug traffickers, or then especially when you get into the mafia, and they're kind of viewed as these immigrants from another country are coming here to deal drugs, when it was, again, an incredibly small percentage of Italian Americans and Jewish Americans and Irish Americans were involved in any kind of criminal activity. But Anslinger kind of spun that racial component to it, which made it even a greater threat in the public's eye, and using some of the sensational headlines and the way he was able to kind of manipulate public perception on that was a benefit to him in terms of funding and how he went after that, but also allowed organized crime groups that weren't Sicilian Mafia or others to probably get away without much law enforcement attention.
Special Treasury agents are part of a massive force created solely to control the traffic in narcotics.
You got any merchandise obtained in Canada or abroad? No. Have you any liquor? No. Get out of the car and let's take a look at it.
He early on attacked the problem. He sent out undercover agents to try to make inroads. They wanted to develop informants and develop intelligence and learn what they were up against.
And really what he did, he started the war on drugs then. A lot of people think the war on drugs was started in the 1970s with Richard Nixon, but it was started by Harry Anslinger in the Federal Bureau of Narcotics in the 1920s.
Move over, J. Edgar Hoover. Here come the agents of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics.
And you had the Federal Bureau of Narcotics detailing these mobsters' activities. for 50 years before the FBI even acknowledged that the mafia existed.
So if you want to talk about a pioneer in law enforcement, Harry Anslinger is one of the first prominent federal law enforcement officials to identify drugs as a significant problem. And he's also one of the first significant members of federal law enforcement to identify the Italian mafia as a menace, as a criminal organization that's involved in narcotics.
There is nothing mysterious about the manner in which the Federal Bureau of Investigation works. Its formula is a simple one: intensive training, carefully investigated, and highly efficient personnel, plus rigid requirements in regard to conduct, intelligence, and integrity.
We have to remember, for a long time, J. Edgar Hoover denied that the mafia even existed. And he pretty much had a hands-off policy in terms of the FBI scrutinizing and investigating the Italian mafia. Anslinger, that was never the case. Right from the beginning, he identified drugs as a significant problem and that the Italian mafia was deeply involved in narcotics.
In pop culture, there's this man of honor myth when it comes to the mafia. But you know, a lot of these mobsters have been getting heroin money since the inception of La Cosa Nostra in this country.
They have dominated the drug trade in America for decades. And the idea that the mafia stayed away from that was first a falsehood. And second of all, I believe it was a falsehood that was promulgated by many mobsters to make their dealings more acceptable and more palatable. That was the mob's dirty secret. They didn't want the public to know that they were profiting so much from narcotics. In my opinion, the fallacy can really all be traced to one root incident, and that was the release of the movie The Godfather. The movie became ingrained in American pop culture very quickly.
I believe this drug business is going to destroy us in the years to come.
This creates this stigma that there's something less moral about dealing drugs as opposed to being involved in gambling, prostitution, extortion, loan sharking. So there's this stigma that it's a dirty business. But the stigma is for audience members.
Everybody, could be my son, could be anybody. Gribb's got 20 years just for saying hello to some fucker who was sneaking behind his back selling junk. I don't need that. Ain't gonna happen.
So that's why it becomes important for the crime bosses in a public relations sense to at least publicly say, we don't deal drugs, we have a prohibition on selling drugs that violates some kind of moral standard. With these gangsters, they don't have a moral standard at all.
Then we are agreed. The traffic in drugs will be permitted, but controlled.
It was this kind of constant mitigating of what was really going on. And in reality, all the way back from Prohibition, all the way into the new millennium, the mafia was making hundreds of millions of dollars in the narcotics trade around the world. There was too many spoils out there for people to turn their head. And in that business, if there's money to be made, risk be damned, we're going all in. And these guys went all in pretty fast. If you do a Freedom of Information Act, you go back and look at documentation records from that period, the stuff that was coming from the FBN is head and shoulders above anything you were getting from the FBI at that time.
The Italian Sicilian organized crime groups went into narcotics in a much bigger way. And when they go into something, they go into it with both feet. We have to recognize that they had become pretty astute at setting up an illegal business during Prohibition. That was not a Mickey Mouse operation. It was a business.
You had mob lieutenants that were smuggling experts, guys that knew that terrain and knew back routes and front routes and side routes, and they knew ways to get contraband from point A to point B, and they knew how to grease the wheels to do that.
The mafia started the first international drug trafficking organization. They were able to combine logistics across multiple continents in a time when communication wasn't nearly what it is today.
it isn't a new concept to have contingency plans. These were probably the smartest group of mobsters of all the 20th century, all together thinking, if you bust this shipment, I'll have 10 more over here. And if competition steps in, we have ways to steal theirs and sell it to their customers. There was no way at that time police could have kept up. Did it create the gangster? No. They just learned business 101 and took it to a master's degree.
When you talk about Fortune 500 companies and the amount of money they make, it doesn't compare with the amount of money. And they were bringing in $1 million a day. In those days, you didn't have the laws where you have to report any transaction over $10,000. In those days, you could send unaccompanied baggage. So he would put a bag on the flight, an Alitalia flight out of Milan going to JFK with a certain mark on it. At JFK, when the bag was taken off the plane, they had one of their people as a baggage handler. They would take that bag and get it out of the airport, and they were bringing in like 20 kilos a day. I mean, it was unbelievable. Any way you can think of them bringing in the heroin, they were bringing in so much besides the heroin in the pallets and in the coffee machines, in the cans of tomatoes and things like that. That's how unbelievable it was.
They started to figure, okay, we won't package it as it is and put it in the trunk. We'll make it look like candy bars. Hide it in machine parts. Nobody's gonna look in there. Even when shipments did get caught, law enforcement still couldn't put it all together. For every shipment that got caught, or there wasn't a paid-off customs officer, there were probably a dozen that made it through. They knew there would be some losses to be cut, but the money was still coming through.
Like with any criminal enterprise, you have to launder that money. At least the smart guys launder that money. The restaurant industry in particular is interesting because you can use that not only as a front for laundering the money, but we know that in a lot of cases, that's where they were actually smuggling the drugs through food products.
The Ezra brothers, who grew up in Shanghai, their dad had run opium farming, which was legal in China. They decided to go into business for themselves. They had been arrested numerous times. They tried for naturalization numerous times. These guys were relentless, but they were known as the twins who supplied raw opium to most of the drug dealers in the United States throughout the entire 1920s.
Arnold Rothstein was a good boss in the way that he protected his men with his army of lawyers, because if he protected his men, he was in fact protecting himself, because you don't want some guy who's arrested gonna blow the whistle if he's looking at 10 years in prison. So you're gonna do everything possible to keep that guy out of prison.
The interesting thing about Lucky Luciano, Legs Diamond, George Uffner, all these guys that were associated with Rothstein, they all had drug arrests, though none of them, except for maybe Uffner, was ever really known as a drug dealer. Rothstein had a team of lawyers and bail money set aside for all these guys, not even getting into how many paid off customs agents and cops they had. Rothstein had the entire picture. Rothstein taught these guys how to get away with it. Rothstein had in place contingency plans if something did happen. They were almost always covered. That's why they outsmarted the government for so long, and why guys like Lucky Luciano and Legs Diamond aren't known as drug lords. Arnold Rothstein was at his favorite restaurant, Lindy's, gets a phone call. He's told he has to meet somebody back at the Park Central Hotel, his favorite hangout. The next anybody knows, Rothstein's shot twice in the groin and stumbling out near the street. Rothstein goes down with the roaring 20s.
Rothstein was most likely killed in an accident. Alcohol-fueled argument over some gambling IOUs that they didn't know if they should honor or not. And he wanted to honor it. George McManus did not want to honor him, and they just got into an argument, and tempers flared and a gun went off, and Arnold got shot in the stomach. So if it was a real hit, he would have got shot in the head. You don't shoot a guy in the belly and leave him walking around.
We don't know who did it. What it did do is raise a lot of suspects. The cops didn't have a lot to go on, but they knew who the big gamblers were who had been surrounding themselves with Arnold Rothstein recently. George Hump McManus was the main suspect in the Arnold Rothstein assassination. Everybody who had a theory kept leaning towards, well, it was probably a gambling problem. Hump McManus was there, allegedly, around him. Hump McManus was the only individual to ever go on trial for the murder of Arnold Rothstein, and he was acquitted. There was not enough evidence to convict him. All the gangsters loved the showgirls. They found out hanging out on Broadway, they would meet them, and the showgirls were equally enamored with the gangsters. Arnold Rothstein was a married man, but his longtime mistress was Inez Norton, another showgirl. She was also a beneficiary of Rothstein's will, which brought her into the sights of police, and they questioned her as well after his murder. No one was ever convicted of the murder of Arnold Rothstein. Still stands as an unsolved case. Rothstein's death opened the door for his students to apply the biggest lesson they ever learned, and that's opportunism.
Once word spread that Arnold Rothstein got shot, all the guys who were working for him went to his offices to steal all his notes, all his records, because they knew they could move up. They could be the ones making the drug dealers. They needed to know which politicians to pay off, how much they were getting, who was paying who. They knew they could take that and they could be the next Arnold Rothstein.
I think a lot of people in the underworld were envious of Arnold Rothstein. They revered him, they looked up to him, especially for his criminal acumen and his ability to understand the business world of racketeering. And if he's doing it and he's being successful at it, and he's kind of given us a little bit of a roadmap, then it's only kind of natural that you would have a lot of his contemporaries, when he died, step up to fill the void.
What Rothstein's death provided was a change in the gangland landscape. So his own students took that lesson and made it their own. Some of them became the most famous gangsters in American pop culture history.
Jack Legs Diamond was New York's most famous gangster during the Prohibition era, and he got the most media attention, and mainly it was because he got shot a lot and survived and bounced back.
Jack Legs Diamond was probably the most famous gangster of his time outside of Al Capone. Capone definitely had most of the headlines, but Diamond was known as far as Europe. He was a folk hero kind of celebrity status.
Jack Legs Diamond, typifying the glorified gangster era of the late 20s. Arrested 17 times, acquitted 17 times. Suspected of every crime in the book, Legs Diamond led a charmed life temporarily.
The funny thing about Legs Diamond is he doesn't have the same story as most of the other gangsters of that era. He didn't come off the boat not speaking the language, being dirt poor. His parents were born in Philadelphia. It was his grandparents who came over from Ireland. He lived in a working class neighborhood in Philadelphia. His dad had a job, his uncle lived with him, he had a job, his aunt lived with him, she had a job, so they weren't hurting for money. There's really no reason for Jack to choose a life of crime, but that's the direction he went into. Jack and his brother Eddie were partners in crime going back to childhood. And as Jack went up the, we'll say the criminal corporate ladder, he brought Eddie with him. Eddie was the only guy he really trusted in his life. The only guy he cared about, really.
Jack also did freelance work as bodyguards or hijacking. Of course, one of his employers happened to be Arnold Rothstein.
Legs Diamond got involved with Rothstein around 1923. Rothstein's widow tells us that Arnold was involved in trying to mediate a strike for a garment factory, and he used the Diamond Gang as muscle, and that got their foot in the door, and they moved on up the ladder from there. And prior to hooking up with Arnold Rothstein, Legs Diamond was the head of his own bandit gang, and they became one of the premier gangs of New York City. They would rob lofts, steal silks, furs, jewelry heists, hijack other people's liquor, anything that could make a buck he was into. And so he had a reputation as being a killer, which helped him, also helped Rothstein, because you wouldn't want to cross Arnold Rothstein if you knew Jack Legs Diamond was going to come and get you. After working for Rothstein for a couple of years, Rothstein saw something in Jack that he was smarter than the average knuckle dragger who came through his office every day. He could carry himself well-spoken. After a few years, Rothstein said, it's time to move up. So he sent him to Europe for a couple of drug deals starting in 1925 and then twice again in 26.
Here's a gangster with folk hero status, known as surviving a bunch of assassination attempts. He's a bootlegger from Albany, New York, but he spent a lot of time running around New York City with his gang, guys like Lucky Luciano, and yes, he did strong-arm work for Arnold Rothstein. But he was also picked up for narcotics in the mid-1920s, and Arnold Rothstein happened to be there, showed up with money as if it was almost like he had him on speed dial. Rothstein knew how to have people or himself show up conveniently at the right time to take care of his guys.
Well, after Rothstein's death, when all the other gangsters came out to pick over his rackets, Legs was never in a position to do anything about that because he was, at the time, in a gang war with Dutch Schultz. So he had to be in hiding. He couldn't come out and operate. So as Luciano and everyone else came and took over the gambling or the drugs, Legs had to stay, just to protect his life. He couldn't operate, so he missed out on the opportunity of a lifetime. Fame was the downfall of Legs Diamond. He couldn't do anything without a newspaper reporter tagging along. He wasn't able to deal in drugs. He wasn't able to deal in the labor rackets because he couldn't move without a photographer around him. And because of his fame, all his gangland associates cut their ties with him.
In the summer of 1930, United States government, already after Jack Legs Diamond for his numerous well-known exploits of gangsterism. This time, they think he's going to Europe. However, they think he's going with a bunch of his friends, also Rothstein minions. The bad guys, one step ahead, find out these guys took off on different ships to different parts of Europe to go establish more alcohol and drug routes. So every ship captain, every border patrol, every immigration office in Europe is waiting for Jack Legs Diamond to come. Jack gets to Europe, they finally catch up with him, and then in Germany, the Germans decide, okay, we're going to arrest this guy and ship him back. All the while, you've got other guys wandering around Europe, setting things up. Jack Legs Diamond is shipped back to Philadelphia on a cargo ship filled with yellow canaries. That was his trip back.
End of an era was in sight as Diamond is again in custody.
The problem for Diamond was, when he was shipped back to the United States, he shipped back without product, and he shipped back without most of the money that was given to him for this investment. Word had spread, Capone invested for him to go. Then there was Salvatore Spital and Irving Bitts. It was those two that provided the $250,000 investment to go to Europe to come back with some product.
Cipollini says, I want my money back. Legge says, it's all gonna blow over, don't worry about it. And finally they got to the point where they ended up going to his hotel room, knocking on the door, pow, 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 pow. Shot him down, and he bounced back and fled the city, went to the Catskills to his house because he knew it was no longer safe for him in the city. So they had to go up to the Catskills to get him. They shot him down again the following spring as he was leaving a bar. And he bounced back from that one. And they finally got him at the end of 1931 in the boarding house. They had to creep up on him and get nice and close and pow, 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 pow. Gave him 3 in the head.
The truth is, if you owe the mob money for anything, be it drugs, especially drugs, but anything, you're gonna pay. At the end of the day, they're gonna send somebody, a bad guy, could be me, could be another guy, a guy like me, but they're gonna make you pay, and you're not gonna run from it. You can't run from it, unless you run to Belize or something and hide. They're gonna get you, and they know that. And they know that. That's the reason why most people pay. What are they gonna do? How are you gonna hide?
When I awakened by newsboys' cries, Jack Diamond slain.
Well, what happened then?
I fainted, and I nearly fell out of the bedroom window.
In the big cities, the gangster funeral becomes a major social event. The mourners frequently include city officials and congressmen.
The death of Jack Legs Diamond, one of the first names brought up was Al Capone's. Again, this isn't something that maybe the public always knew, but if you were reading the papers at the time, police immediately wondered, Capone, we hear there was investment money given to Jack Legs Diamond for a European vacation for liquor or dope. Yeah, Capone was definitely involved with the original dope men. Al Capone knew where money was to be made, and being so tight with his old New York friends, of course. So that's why, for a brief time, Al Capone's name kept coming up. Who really killed Legs Diamond and Arnold Rothstein? Why are these guys connected to Chicago? Because dope shipments were being trained to Chicago. Capone was definitely involved in the entire narcotics trade. He just wasn't one of the names that first popped up.
Lucky Luciano, next to maybe Al Capone, is probably the best known gangster in American history. He's credited as being the founder of the commission, kind of the architect of what the modern American mob became after the early Sicilian mafia groups in the United States. He was also very close with Arnold Rothstein, Meyer and involved in narcotics, although he was never ever convicted of narcotics. There's a lot of evidence that he was involved both in financing of heroin shipments and involved in some trafficking organizations, especially when he was younger before he became as well known as a boss.
Charlie Lucky Luciano, known as one of the more enigmatic pop culture kind of gangsters of the mob heyday of the Depression era. Luciano, till the day he died in 1962, was always considered an international drug lord by the federal government, though there was never any proof. But what most people don't know is how Charlie Lucky Luciano fit into the Roaring '20s era of original drug lords.
Luciano was involved with drugs back when he was a teenager. He was getting busted for drugs before Legs Diamond was even involved in narcotics at all. But as a purchaser of drugs, Luciano had to go wherever the dealer was, which was Rothstein. And Legs Diamond, though not a drug seller himself, working for Rothstein, was one of the men who went to Europe to procure the drugs, and then he would deal with the street dealers such as Luciano.
Legs, give him some cigars.
Bang. Gangster myth dictates that Luciano got his nickname Lucky from surviving a one-way ride. Rival gangsters picked him up, stabbed him, threw him out of the car, and left him for dead. According to the journalist, he survived a one-way ride, and that's where Lucky comes from. But the truth is, he was hiding out Legs, who was wanted for a murder at the time. The pressure was getting too much, so the detectives picked up Luciano, beat the hell out of him. You know, tell us where Legs is, tell us where Legs is. But Luciano knew they weren't going to kill him, so he just sat it out until he went unconscious, and then they dumped him on the shore in Staten Island. The press found out about it, and they assumed it was a one-way ride, and Luciano let them think that.
Luciano was a individual who, although born in Sicily, was Americanized in the sense of he was not on the same page as the Greenies, the Mustache Pete's. He saw the beauty of the structure and code, but all this acting honorably and all, he didn't believe in it.
Heroína. No me interesa el Cuba.
He was mentored by Rothstein, which also indicated his Americanization in looking to him rather than some Mustache Pete boss that he worked for, and learned the business way of running a criminal enterprise. He certainly became a major factor, probably the most important early year American mafia boss in history.
So 1928, Arnold Rothstein was assassinated. So Lucky Luciano pretty much took over his mantle, his empire. He was mentored by Rothstein, so he was in a good position to take control of a lot of these networks. He was of Italian ancestry, so he ran with the Italian mob, like officially. The old godfathers of the Italian mafia at the time, they wanted to keep it exclusive, like they didn't want to deal with any non-Italians. Whereas Lucky Luciano, he grew up with Jews like Meyer and Arnold Rothstein. He wanted to diversify. He realized that crooks of all creeds and colors should be working together to rip off the working man. Eventually, he basically ousted Joe the Boss in a coup, and he took over as the boss of his crime family, and he reshaped the American criminal underworld.
There's 7 bosses, a commission, 5 families in New York, plus Buffalo and Chicago.
Lucky Luciano becomes the poster boy for the American mob. Relatively unknown all that time until the point Thomas E. Dewey steps into office in New York.
Is everything set?
We've got a full list. Every gangster in the mob is being watched this minute.
Any signs of leak? They don't suspect a thing. Then it's 10 tonight. Pick up the 15 ringleaders first.
With crack New York detectives, Dewey's roundup was skillfully directed. Mob after mob was taken by surprise. Simultaneously, all over the city, the underworld was rounded up.
He first goes after Dutch Schultz, another Rothstein student. Dutch gets killed. Lucky Luciano moved on to become famous for being the head of the mafia. That becomes public enemy number 1.
Anslinger tended to get fixed ideas not only about law and policy, but about particular individuals. And one of those was Lucky Luciano. Anslinger's animus against Luciano was not one that was deeply thought through. He held fast to it as he held to many of his ideas, unwilling to complicate it or change it. Luciano also had an animus against Anslinger for obvious reasons. I believe Luciano was probably more psychologically complex than Anslinger was, and perhaps he had more of a sense of humor, as he referred to the commissioner by the nickname Asslinger.
Anslinger spent his entire life going after narcotics dealers. His primary target was Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano goes on trial in 1936 for basically being a pimp. Now, most people would argue that it was not necessarily what he really did as a criminal, but just like in the case of Capone, his old friend, they needed to find something. Luciano was taught a lesson by being given a 30 to 50 year sentence.
Anslinger and the Federal Bureau of Narcotics quickly identified tactics that they were using as a way to to flesh these guys out in the open. And when it came to, certain people, Lucky Luciano, Vito Genovese, big names, it was a way to put them in jail. A lot quicker, a lot faster, and a lot easier than, going after them on other traditional rackets, or even going after them the way they went after Capone for tax evasion.
Lucky Luciano gets out of prison early. To this day, nobody really knows what went on behind the scenes to get him out of prison early. But he gets out. He's immediately exiled.
And even after he was deported to Italy in the 1940s, he set up shop for a little while in Havana, Cuba, and he met with mobsters there. That culminates in the 1946 Havana Conference. And he also becomes very close with mobsters in Italy when he's living in Italy in the late 1950s. And there's a number of Bureau of Narcotics efforts and cases where associates of Luciano in Italy are arrested for heroin trafficking. So he's always kind of a figure around a lot of the mafia drug activities in the early 20th century.
He's also exceptionally good at facilitating the drug trade. In other words, helping put Italian-American mafiosi in connection with Sicilian traffickers. So he's quite good at that. But his story is complicated. And what I push back against is this narrative that Charlie Luciano was somehow this nefarious global drug lord pulling all the strings of the international drug trade. And if you look back at some of the public relations, what I would call propaganda coming from Harry Anslinger and the FBN, that's almost how they describe Luciano. And you can even see this in congressional committee hearings, where they're basically trying to make the argument that Lucky Luciano would be like the equivalent of like a Pablo Escobar of the Italian mafia, right? This global drug lord pushing all the buttons, and that's just not true. Luciano died with very little money, and he was exceptionally good at coordinating things and putting people in touch with each other. So he's very good at that, networking. But by no means should we think of him as this supreme drug lord on the same type of scale as what we see in Latin America in the last 30 years.
Harry Anslinger, the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, had his eyes still set on Luciano as a drug dealer. The Federal Bureau of Narcotics was probably the only government entity that played as dirty as they had to in order to get these drug dealers, because they understood that the drug lords and players in that game were very different than every other racketeering element. So they played different. Anslinger was dead set on proving that Luciano, in prison or out, now or then, was an international drug lord. So till the day Lucky Luciano died, Harry Anslinger and his underlings chased, followed, and spied on Luciano to try to get enough to prove he was basically dealing the most heroin in the world, or at least called most of the shots. Nothing was ever proven, but that label kept Luciano relevant in the news throughout the 1950s till the day he died in 1962. The root of the heroin addiction that still goes on today dates back over a century. This problem was not addressed properly then, and we're still dealing with it now.
We're back now with another report in our series Hooked, America's Heroin Epidemic. Tonight we visit the Chicago area, where federal, state, and local authorities are banding together to fight the explosion of the drug.
What the original dope men established, going as far back as the 1920s or earlier, is something that was just adapted over time, and different drug dealers and entities came into the picture as the decades went on. They always had a consumer. It's only gotten bigger. We still have massive opiate addiction in this country.
Young ladies and gentlemen, for many years I have stood here for the purpose of pointing out the dangers of drug addiction. I shall pull no punches. It is a serious problem, and I shall approach it with all of the force and urgency that the situation warrants.
In the intervening decades, while the drug war has become larger and more elaborate, it functions along some of the very same principles that Anslinger laid down, and it works its way through many of the exact same institutions that it did in the 50s, 60s, 70s. So many decades later, we are still seeing the effects of a prohibitionist approach to drug law and policy in the United States.
You can't really regulate human behavior. Throughout the ages, all the main religions, they've all tried to change human behavior to what they think it should be, and it never works. People are still doing these things. People are still committing extramarital affairs, even though it's one of the 10 commandments, you know? So no attempt to change human nature through enforcement is going to work like that. So you might as well find a way to live with it somehow.
You know, the war on drugs now is going on almost 80 years. And I don't know if we really even made a dent.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
I'm sure it can be frustrating for the people that are fighting it. I think there have been little victories here and there, but when your entire focus is on taking down these big game or going after heads on your wall, you quickly fall into a pattern of whack-a-mole, where you take down your 3 biggest targets, and in a blink of an eye, there are 3 people that just replace them, and nothing's been disrupted. The early approach on the war on drugs was probably more effective than the approach that they've had in the last 30, 40 years.
This is your brain. And this is heroin. This is what happens to your brain after snorting heroin.
Anslinger and his men, had the right approach. They had, in some ways, they kind of cracked the code. Now, they weren't able to maybe finish off what they started, but, I think they had the right approach.
If the goal of the war on drugs is to eliminate all drugs from the United States, I don't think that's winnable. Does that mean we give up? Does that mean we say, well, we can't win, so let's have we'll just legalize it, everybody can use drugs? And that's foolish. That's a foolish thing.
And now to the growing acceptance of legalized marijuana across the country. Nearly half of Americans now have access to legally purchased marijuana in their home states.
The narcotics program has had great successes. We haven't won it, but having the drug programs, having people seizing drugs, putting people in jail, is a suppressive element, and we need that.
Incarceration is never going to solve our drug problem. Ever since the beginning of the international drug trade in the 20s, there's been these governing bodies in the government, like the Bureau of Narcotics, and then the DEA. They want to prosecute all these people and put people in jail, but really, the drugs are still there, because, you cut off one head, 5 more are going to pop up, so it really doesn't matter what happened. If there's a demand for drugs, the supply is going to be met, and the people that are meeting the supply are the people in organized crime.
The war on drugs has perpetually failed to achieve its own stated goals, and yet it is an extremely durable and popular program in place for 7 decades, though it fails consistently to meet its own goals.
Drugs are menacing our society. They're threatening our values and undercutting our institutions. They're killing our children.
There must be other social goods that it is delivering, because it is not delivering a drug-free society. Incarcerating people does not prevent them from recidivism. Harsh penalties do not act as deterrents against crime in the first place. So what social good is being delivered? It looks like the social control that is manifest in the incarceration of the population that we have in prison in this country today.
I'm shocked to see that after all these years later, that our country is overrun with heroin addicts, even in the smallest of rural communities, where it just wouldn't be expected. I think sometimes about what can we do differently. I know that people have said that enforcement isn't the answer, but let me tell you something. If we didn't have enforcement and all drugs were legal, which I hear people say, you know what? There'd still be organized crime, there'd still be trafficking, there'd still be murders, because the criminal element would just be developing a cheaper product and an easier way to get it to the community. There's always going to be trafficking.
War is not the term to use. What we have is an illegal substance. As long as it is illegal, it needs to be prosecuted. For it to be prosecuted, it needs to be investigated. Evidence needs to be accumulated. So what we have is a continual, from 1930, program, effort, whatever you want to call it, against narcotic trafficking.
The original dope men of the 20s and 30s, their names would come up during Senate hearings or investigations.
Attorney General Robert Kennedy paints a grim picture of the rise of lawlessness under the Cosa Nostra, or mafia. This he describes as the government of organized gambling, narcotics peddling, extortion, racketeering, and controlling of certain trade unions.
History still kinda didn't recognize the overall picture of where we are today and how it really got started with a man named Arnold Rothstein and 4 or 5 guys that he had traveling around the world setting up drug trafficking pipelines.